October 5th will mark the 60th anniversary of the James Bond franchise. As an avid fan of the series, I have decided to commemorate that date by reviewing all of the films from my least favourite to my most favourite. Please be warned, these reviews will involve spoilers. Also, I will be including the 1967 James Bond spoof Casino Royale and the unofficial 1983 Bond film Never Say Never Again in my rankings. Dr. No was the first official James Bond film. In the film, James Bond investigates the disappearance of British agent John Strangways in Jamaica. Through his investigations, Bond discovers a plot to destroy the US space program at Cape Canaveral by the evil Dr. No. More importantly, however, Dr. No established the cinematic world of James Bond. Curiously, Dr. No is part detective story and part fantasy. James Bond is sent to Jamaica to investigate the disappearance of John Strangways. Assuming the mantle of a detective, the film shows Bond following leads whilst dodging various assassination attempts. Similarly, there are elements of fantasy within this film. Everything seems larger than life. One can even see the similarities between the story structure of this film and such stories like St. George and the Dragon. The exterior scenes on Crab Key, for example, have a dreamlike quality to them. Dr. No's subterranean lair seems to have more in common with a Jules Verne novel than a traditional spy thriller. Admittedly, Dr. No doesn't have much of a story. What it did do, however, was establish the themes and motifs we would come to associate with Bond. The Bond films are myths for the modern world. They take the contemporary world and make it extraordinary. In fact, it could be argued that the Bond films acted as a kind of soothing balm during a time when the British Empire was in terminal decline. The British had once presided over an empire upon which the sun had never set. In the wake of the Second World War, however, the British lost much of their power and prestige. This became especially apparent following the Suez Crisis of 1957. From Westminster Palace to Government House in Jamaica, Dr. No is filled with symbols of British authority and power. Many of the characters in Dr. No establish the character archetypes that we would come to associate with the Bond films. And this begins with James Bond himself. A lot of this film is devoted to establishing the character of James Bond and the world he operates in. We are introduced to Bond playing Chemin de Fer at Le Cercle in London. In quick succession, we see Bond receive his mission from M and return to his apartment where he has a liaison with Sylvia Trench. Later, we see Bond shoot Professor Dent in cold blood. This was Connery's breakout film, and it was obvious from the outset that he was destined to become a big star. In Connery's capable hands, we get a Bond who has undertones of Humphrey Bogart, tough and cynical, but with a heart of gold, and David Niven, elegant and sophisticated. In Connery's capable hands, Bond can play Chemin de Fer in an exclusive London club in one scene, and execute an enemy in cold blood in another. The mixture of these two qualities, which have never quite been equalled before or since, is what makes Bond such a compelling character. I do not find Dr. Julius No to be the most exciting Bond villain, but he does establish the template for all the Bond films that were to follow. Much of Dr. No is devoted to building the character of Dr. No up. Bond, Quarrel, and Felix Leiter discuss Dr. No. We hear a voice and we see his legs and prosthetic hands. By the time we get to see Dr. No, he has been so built up in our imaginations that his presence is undeniable. Although he is described as a nuclear scientist, Dr. No actually has more in common with evil wizards in old stories than anything else. To this end, radiation could be seen as the equivalent of black magic. Indeed, Dr. No appears to combine the existential evil of Dracula with the genius criminality of Fu Manchu or Moriarty. In fact, it could be argued that Dr. No represents evil incarnate. Anthony Dawson's Professor Dent is slimy and creepy. He makes for an excellent secondary villain. The rest of the film's villains, however, are hardly worth mentioning. It is sometimes claimed that Honey Rider represents the archetype of the Bond girl. I do not entirely agree with this. Rather, I think that the archetype of the Bond girl is represented by all three girls in the movie. Although she is not necessarily the best developed character, Sylvia Trench represents grace, elegance and sophistication. Miss Taro represents the femme fatale. As a double agent and a honey trap, Miss Taro represents the dangerous, evil side of femininity, as well as the corrupting influence of society. Honey Rider is essentially a fantasy character, a potent mix of sex and innocence. She represents the benevolence of nature. Jack Lord portrays the best Felix Leiter in the series, mostly because he is presented as Bond's equal. Quarrel is a memorable ally, even if Bond telling him to, quote, fetch my shoes, unquote, is rather cringeworthy. Dr. No introduced us to M and Miss Moneypenny. To this day, Bernard Lee is the quintessential M, and the one who comes closest to the character in Ian Fleming's original novels. Lee's M is clearly modelled after Sir Winston Churchill. Miss Money, played by Lois Maxwell, has excellent chemistry with Bond. The fact that Dr. No was made for just $1 million, roughly $10 million in today's money, never ceases to amaze me. Despite its minuscule budget, the Bond filmmakers managed to deliver an exciting adventure film that doesn't seem too dated. The reason they were able to do this is because they knew how to use story, editing and direction to create as much fantasy and suspense as possible. There are, of course, moments when the film seems dated or when it could have benefited from a larger budget, but these moments are few and far between. I don't think anyone would describe director Terence Young as particularly great on a technical level. He's certainly no Orson Welles or Stanley Kubrick. What Young did do, however, was establish the style of James Bond. It was Terence Young who taught Sean Connery how to walk and talk like an English gentleman. Editor Peter Hunt did a superb job in creating momentum in the film. As a result of Hunt's editing, one never feels bored watching Dr. No, something, sadly, which cannot be said for some of the Daniel Craig films. Furthermore, Hunt does a good job at disguising the shortcomings of Terence Young's direction, even if that does involve a lot of jump cuts. Ted Moore's cinematography is lush and beautiful. He uses rich colours and deep focused photography to make the audience feel like they are lost on an island paradise. Ken Adams' sets are remarkable. The nuclear reactor room is still impressive after 60 years. Monty Norman's score is one of the few areas where Dr. No does seem dated. It very much has that late 50s, early 60s vibe. The titles are okay, but they are not what we would come to expect in a James Bond film. In a debate with David Zaritsky, Bond vlogger Calvin Dyson referred to this film as being, quote-unquote, vanilla. Although I think Calvin Dyson is wrong, I can understand where he is coming from. This is the film that established many of the themes, tropes, motifs, and archetypes we have come to associate with Bond. As a result, many of the Bond films that followed have managed to use these things to much greater effect. However, a deep respect must be given to this film for establishing the world of James Bond in the first place. Furthermore, it is still an incredible film to watch. My favourite moment of Dr. No is the scene in which Bond shoots Professor Dent. This is a character-defining moment. We've already been told that Bond has a license to kill. However, it is here that we learn that Bond is fully prepared to use it. My least favourite moment is the car chase. This is one of the few times when one can see the limitations of Dr. No's budget. Between the cringe-worthy rear projection and the awkward ending, this is one of the weakest action sequences in the entire franchise.